Witness mic check for the stenographer. Witness mic check. Witness mic check 1. 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 You're good?
Good morning. I call this legislative hearing to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I would like to welcome you all to the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs legislative hearing, where we will hear testimony on 10 pieces of legislation. The vast majority of these proposals are bipartisan in nature, something that is a hallmark of this committee. As chair of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, I have heard from veterans and their families on the importance of getting timely and accurate decisions on their claims for VA benefits. I've heard how devastating it can be for a veteran and their family when they are victims of fraud. Without pause, I know that Congress and the VA must do more to serve our veterans and protect them from fraudulent practices. I'm grateful to my colleagues for their bipartisan efforts to work towards this goal. One example of this is Representative Brownlee's bill, H.R. 592, the Protect Veterans from Financial Fraud Act, which would provide parity in protecting veterans who are victims of fraud. Each year, countless veterans have their benefits stolen by their fiduciary, but for some veterans, they cannot recoup their benefits from the VA unless their fiduciary manages 10 or more veterans due to a bureaucratic loophole. Ms. Brownlee's bill puts an end to this disparity. I'm a proud original co-sponsor of Representative Khanna's bill, H.R. 4183, Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Study Act. This bill helps identify barriers and benefit disparities between veterans who served in the Guard, Reserve, and active duty, and special programs such as those who served in the nuclear field. For any barriers identified, this bill also requests recommendations for overcoming those barriers so we can ease the pathway to benefits for those veterans. I also want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. With that, I would like to recognize Ranking Member Boss for his opening statement. Mr. Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank everyone for joining us here today to discuss some of these important pieces of legislation that will be before the subcommittee. The bills on today's agenda are intended to address issues that are very important to veterans and their families. One of the bills is H.R. 628. 628 would allow members to help constituents who simply want to understand the status of their claim for benefits. This bill will permit certain full-time congressional staffers to look up the status of veterans' claims on VA claims system, but only if the veteran has given the staffer permission. This access will provide congressional employees with an insight needed to quickly verify that the VA is working on the veteran's case and to provide a status update to the constituents. Moreover, the staffer would be able to confirm the VA has received important documents such as the veteran's claim form or private medical records. Back in my district, I'm approached constantly by veterans who would like to know where their claim is and where it's at in the process. I employ a full-time caseworker. Actually, I have 2 whose sole responsibility is to work on constituents' assistance in their VA claims, and both of them are disabled veterans, so they understand how difficult this can be to deal with. You know, frequently this means that the caseworker is writing to the VA on behalf of veterans just to find out what's going on with their case. It can be very frustrating to wait weeks for the VA to get back to us when a VA employee can access this information within minutes. Representative Yoho would cut through the red tape and allow members from the offices to provide veterans with immediate feedback. I look forward to discussing H.R. 628 and how it will help our constituents and serve our veterans. Another bill, H.R. 1424, would require VA national cemeteries to allow the display of battlefield crosses, which is a monument that depicts a fallen service member by an inverted rifle with a helmet and dog tags on top and a pair of combat boots at the bottom. Many of us have seen this symbol. This is an image that every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform knows, and unfortunately knows it too well. In 2017, a VA employee misinterpreted the VA's policy and removed a battlefield cross from the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery because it was a weapon, or the symbol of a weapon. In response to the veterans and congressional concerns over the incident, The department reinstated the monument and clarified the cemetery can display this image. However, this bill is necessary to codify this clarification and ensure that VA does not ban this sacred image again. I support this bill and appreciate Representative Gonzalez's leadership on this issue. Additionally, we will be discussing H.R. 1911, which will be introduced by Representative Waltz. This bill will make numerous changes to the VA and DOD benefits for surviving spouses. Today, I would like to focus on the provisions that would allow surviving spouses to continue to receive dependency and indemnity compensation on DIC or DIC should they remarry regardless of age. We owe a solemn debt to the men and women who laid down their lives in defense of our country, and for those that have made the ultimate sacrifice. Our nation has a responsibility to take care of their families. For that reason, the VA provides DIC to survivors to make up for the loss of income that results from the veteran's death, but can never make up for the death itself. Currently, only surviving spouses who are over the age of 57 are able to continue receiving DIC if they are remarried. This is similar to other government survivor benefits such as Social Security, civil service programs, in which the survivor is able to retain their benefits even if they remarry after a certain age. I'm interested in learning more about whether it would be appropriate for a DIC to be the first government surviving program to remove this restriction. I know many of my colleagues here today have worked hard on their proposals. I look forward to discussing how these bills will improve the lives of our veterans and their families. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bost. For the first panel, we will hear testimony from the members who introduced some of the legislation before us today. First, we have Representative Cisneros from California, who sits on this subcommittee. And next, we have Representative Brownlee, also from California, who chairs the Subcommittee on Health. Welcome to you both. Without objection, several of our colleagues will join us for today's hearing. Representative Delgado from New York, Representative Gonzalez from Ohio, Representative Yoho from Florida, and Representative Waltz, also from Florida. With that, I now recognize Representative Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for providing a hearing on my legislation, H.R. 4748, the Justice for ALS Veterans Act. I was proud to introduce this bill with my colleague, Congressman Fitzpatrick, Chairman of the Congressional ALS Caucus, and want to sincerely thank him for his leadership on this devastating disease. Our legislation would help ease the financial stress surviving family members face when a veteran is diagnosed with ALS dies. ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, affects nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. This disease progresses quickly, eventually preventing the victims from being able to walk, write, speak, or even breathe on their own. Members of the military are twice as likely to develop ALS, with 1 in 6 ALS patients having served. No cure exists, no definitive explanation for its cause. But what we do know is that the disease is always fatal and devastating for the entire family involved. One such family is that of Marine Corps veteran George Vasiloff, who was diagnosed with ALS in September 2013. The VA rated him as 100% disabled as of November 2013. Less than 2 years later, he died, leaving behind his wife, Jan, and 2 children. Under current law, Jan is not entitled to increased dependency and indemnity compensation, despite caring for her husband's Service Connect disability until the day he died. Currently, an eligible survivor of a veteran affected with a service-connected disability only qualifies for increased DIC if the service-connected disability was rated a total disability for a continuous period of at least 8 years immediately prior to death. But with a 2 to 5 year life expectancy, veterans with ALS do not live long enough to meet the eligibility criteria. The Justice for ALS Veterans Act of 2019 would correct this injustice by extending the increased DIC payment to surviving spouses of veterans who die from ALS, regardless of how long the veteran had the disease prior to death. Watching a loved one's life tragically cut short by ALS takes incredible strength and courage. No one should have to take on the emotional and financial burden of this disease alone, especially not family of our veterans, who are twice as likely to develop ALS as those who have not served. This is a common-sense, bipartisan legislation supported by the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Wounded Warrior Project, and the ALS Association. I thank the committee for holding this hearing and urge that it be marked up with deliberate speed. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. I apologize for the initial mistake. Each member presenting their bill will be given 2 minutes due to the large amount of legislation that we'll be considering today. And I next recognize Ms. Brownlee for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and the subcommittee for considering my legislation, the Protect Veterans from Financial Fraud Act, to ensure that every veteran who has served our country so bravely receive the benefits they have earned and deserved, and for Congress to fulfill America's promises. As you know, the VA assigns fiduciaries to assist more than 177,000 veterans or their family members with managing their VA benefits. These are our most vulnerable veterans who are unable to manage their own financial decisions because of their age or their health conditions. A fiduciary helps to ensure that a veteran's benefits are used in the best interest of the veteran, and the fiduciary is a critically important role at a time when the veterans need their assistance the most. Under federal law, VA has the authority to remove a VA-appointed fiduciary who has misused or stolen a veteran's benefits. In fact, in fiscal year 2019, sadly, 975 fiduciaries were removed based upon a finding of misuse. When a fiduciary steals a veteran's benefits, this directly takes away money from a veteran and can result in the inability to pay for basic necessities such as housing and food. But perhaps even more important, the fiduciary has stolen a veteran's dignity. VA can only reissue these benefits to the veterans if their fiduciary manages VA benefits for at least 9 other veterans. This 10 or more rule prevents VA from making all veterans whole when they have been taken advantage of by those entrusted to care for their finances at a very vulnerable time in their lives. My bill would ensure that all veterans in VA's fiduciary program can recover misused or stolen benefits. To not restore these benefits because someone else abused their responsibilities, in my opinion, is truly inexcusable, and it must stop. Both VA and our VSOs support extending these protections to all beneficiaries in the fiduciary program, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill to correct this cruel injustice and ensure that every veteran is fully protected from any fraud or abuse. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. And Mr. Delgado, you are now recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Loria and Ranking Member Boss, for the opportunity to testify today about my bill, the Improving Benefits for Underserved Veterans Act, legislation to better understand the needs of our nation's veterans. Throughout the years, our armed forces have become increasingly diverse, with more women and minority groups serving our country. In fact, in my district alone, there are more than 40,000 veterans, nearly 10% of which are women, a trend that will only increase in the coming years. Female veterans are also the fastest growing segment of the homeless veteran population. And in 2016, the suicide rate of women veterans was nearly twice the suicide rate of non-veteran women. This summer, I visited a number of veterans organizations and facilities in upstate New York, including the Samaritan Daytop Village in Ellenville, the Catskill VA Clinic, and the Albany Stratton VA, to better understand the health care needs of women veterans, and learned that many female and minority group veterans are unaware of their entitled benefits, leaving critical benefits unused. My legislation, the Improving Benefits for Underserved Veterans Act, would direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to publish a report on veterans' benefits, disaggregating by sex and minority group status. This would help Congress and the VA better understand which benefits these groups are utilizing, and importantly, which benefits they are not utilizing. This forward-looking report will also allow Congress and the VA to foresee trends and needs in veterans' benefits and better understand how to serve them in the future. I am grateful to the House Veterans Affairs Committee for all of its hard work on what will become the Deborah Sampson Act, which, if enacted, would be the most comprehensive legislation helping to serve women service members, and I am so happy it includes the Improving Benefits for Underserved Veterans Act. I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak on this important issue. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Delgado. Mr. Gonzalez, you are now recognized for 2 minutes.
Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the first piece of legislation I introduced as a member of Congress, H.R. 1424, the Fallen Warrior Battlefield Cross Memorial Act. Battlefield Cross Memorials commemorate the service of fallen soldiers who have given their lives in service to our country. And as Strongsville VFW Post Commander Tim Zvanchik puts it, it's imperative that this custom continues to be displayed for as long as the sons and daughters of this nation are willing to give their lives in its defense. I am proud to carry on the work of my predecessor, Congressman Jim Renacci, who introduced a version of this bill last Congress. As combat veteran Michael Kuhn from Massillon explained to me, the Battlefield Cross encapsulates so many of the most important things to a combat vet: his rifle, his boots, his tags, and most of all, his fallen comrade. It's extremely important for us to have those things wrapped up in one memorial for us to kneel to, grieve with, and talk to our brothers in arms that have died the ultimate death. The presence of a Battlefield Cross Memorial in a national cemetery has been a non-controversial, time-honored tradition since at least the Civil War. However, in the fall of 2017, Battlefield Cross Memorials in Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan were abruptly removed. A VA employee mistakenly said it was because they violated administration policy by depicting a replica of a rifle. This is significant mischaracterization of the policy's intent. After pressure from veterans and widespread local support, the VA returned to these memorials to their sites, but the future of the Battlefield Cross Memorials remains uncertain. The bill codifies protections for Battlefield Cross Memorials, securing their placement in national cemeteries across the country. One of the greatest champions for this cause was Elton Boyer, president of the 555th Honors Detachment in my district. He passed away this weekend, but it was Elton's mission to erect a battlefield cross at the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery in Seville, Ohio, using the spent brass from military funerals. My bill protects his work, clarifying that no administrative policy change can allow the removal of this memorial. Thank you to the subcommittee for holding a hearing on H.R. 1424. I urge passage of this legislation by the committee at the earliest possible opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Yoho, you're now recognized for 2 minutes.
Chairman Loria, Ranking Member Boss, and committee members, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify on the bill H.R. 628, the Wingman Act, which is an acronym for Working to Integrate Networks Guaranteeing Member Access Now. This bill is a simple, common-sense bill that allows the VA to focus on claims without having to act as the middleman when Congress needs to access a document in their database. This bill has had strong bipartisan support for the last 3 Congresses and has passed the House unanimously twice, and I look forward to passing again. We spend, as Congressman Boss brought up, we spend probably 56% of our time in district and here in D.C. with veterans cases, and we're honored to do that. And this bill, the genesis, came out of the frustration of veterans and our caseworkers that there's got to be a better way or quicker way that we can facilitate the VA and the caseworkers. And I understand the VA has some concerns with this bill and that many people in the room have echoed them. So I'd like to take a moment to address some of the biggest concerns. First, privacy. I, like everyone else in this room, believe that privacy is utmost, and that is the #1 concern. We're on a secure server, the same kind of security that the VA has, and so those databases are protected. We only are asked to do this by a veteran that has come to us and says, can you help us with our claim? They filled a privacy form, we filled that out, we access the same VA system, and it's not to interfere, it's read-only access so that we can peek in and say, this is the status of your claim, and this is what maybe you didn't fill out the form right, you didn't dot the I, you didn't cross it, cross the T, or you didn't sign it. And these are things that we can expedite it because, as we've heard, sometimes these cases take weeks, if not months. I've heard some up to 6 months to a year. And this is a way to expedite it, and it's focused on the veterans' customer service. We are not looking to create jobs or take jobs away from the VA or the VSOs or any veteran organization. We're looking to facilitate and give customer service to our veterans, and we appreciate the bipartisan support that we've had, and we look forward to working with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to come here and you looking at this and putting your eyes on it, because the bottom line is we've got to take care of our veterans. They've given us the liberties and freedoms we have, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I now recognize Mr. Waltz for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Boss, for hosting today's legislative hearing. Earlier this year, along with Representatives Seth Moulton and Don Bacon, I introduced H.R. 1911, the Sergeant First Class Brian Woods Gold Star and Military Survivors Act. This legislation is named in memory of a Green Beret that I had the honor of serving with who was killed in Afghanistan in 2009. I am thankful to Armed Services Committee Chairman Adam Smith and Ranking Member Mac Thornberry for including several provisions of this legislation in the House mark of this year's Defense Authorization Bill, and I'm confident that they will be retained in conference. Therefore, the focus of my testimony will be on sections 3 and 6 of this legislation. And let me first state, I fully support eliminating the SBP DIC offset. However, my legislation addresses a separate aspect of these two benefit programs for surviving spouses. We all know that the families of our service members wait for their loved one's safe return, often anxiously waiting to hear from them once more. Unfortunately for some, what they hear is the chilling knock on their door from a chaplain. It changes them forever, and it makes them part of the Gold Star family. Under current law, if a Gold Star spouse remarries, as Ranking Member Boss mentioned, prior to turning 55, they lose their SBP. If they remarry after turning 55, the SBP continues uninterrupted. For the DIC, a Gold Star spouse loses those benefits if they remarry prior to turning 57. I don't know where these numbers come from, but that's the law. I would like to highlight under a quirk of the law, Section 1311 Echo of USC 38, surviving spouses who remarry after age 57 receive both SBP and DIC in full. Colleagues, this makes no sense. My legislation simply allows surviving spouses to continue to move forward with their lives, allow them to remarry, free of fear for losing their benefits owed to them for their family's noble sacrifice. Instead, we now have spouses trying to move forward with the next phase of their lives, and they should not be penalized. Like, as a combat veteran, a Green Beret, this is personal for me. This is also a strategic issue for our volunteer military. We are 18 years into the war on terror. I firmly believe we're only in the beginning stages of a multi-generational war. This is a team effort on these constant deployments, and they are constantly deciding whether to continue to deploy. The bottom line is if our family support starts cracking, the entire foundation of our modern military is in trouble. I ask this committee to favorably report this important legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz. I now recognize Mr. Khanna for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Loria, for your leadership on so many issues. It's really been a pleasure working with you on H.R. 4183. We need more veterans like you in Congress, and this subcommittee is fortunate to have you as its chair. I'd also like to thank Congresswoman Aumua Amata and Congressman Cisneros, who sit on this subcommittee, for their co-sponsorship of this bill. The Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Act will require the GAO to look at disability and pension data over the last decade to identify what, if any, barriers exist for these veterans and provide recommendations for overcoming those barriers. Veterans who have served in groups such as pilots, aircrew, drivers, and special forces report difficulty in establishing pensions, service connection, and medical treatment for injuries occurred while serving. We've heard this happens because for them to continue service, they avoid documenting their injuries. The bill proves our democracy still works. A constituent of mine, Jerry Cromry from Sunnyvale, California, who served in the U.S. Air Force Reserves, literally attended every monthly town hall of mine. Each time he raised this issue, and as a result of this advocacy, we are now having this legislative hearing in the U.S. House Veterans Affairs Committee, and thanks to Chairwoman Luria's leadership. I want to thank the many veteran service organizations who are supportive of this bill. I'd also like to thank Sam Fryanko, who Gio has said on the subcommittee has really been instrumental in making this bill happen in this hearing today. So thank you, Sam. I hope we can move this bill out of the subcommittee and this bill becomes law so that we can make sure that all our veterans get the treatment and care they deserve and that their disabilities are addressed. I yield back and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Khanna. We will now move to panel 2. I will introduce the members, but you are welcome to go ahead and come forward to the table. For our second panel, we have Mr. Ronald Burke, Executive Director of Pension and Fiduciary Service of the Veterans Benefits Administration. He is accompanied by Ms. Kimberly McLeod, Deputy Vice Chairman of the Board of Veterans Appeals. So welcome to Mr. Burke and Ms. McLeod. And Mr. Burke, you're first recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Loria, Ranking Member Bost, and subcommittee members. Thank you for providing VA the opportunity to discuss several VA-related bills currently pending in Congress. In this testimony, I'll be providing views for the Department of Veterans Affairs on pending legislation. VA supports H.R. 1030 and also supports H.R. 592 if amended. We would like to provide technical assistance to clarify language in both bills. VA has no objection to H.R. 1424 as the National Cemetery Administration allows for display of fallen soldier memorials. VA does not oppose H.R. 4183 but notes concerns with data being available from DoD and making comparisons between military components that have different statutory requirements for service. VA cites concerns with Section 6B of H.R. 1911. This section resumes payment of DIC to surviving spouses remarried prior to age 57, even prior to enactment. This poses a significant administrative burden in identifying and locating potential beneficiaries whose names and whereabouts would need to be determined. VA also cites concerns with the Justice for ALS Veterans Act of 2019 as it creates disparity of benefit entitlement surviving spouses of veterans who passed away from other progressive diseases, such as cancer, in less than the 8-year period. VA does not support H.R. 4165. The data collection in this bill is not necessary for the administration of veterans' benefits and adds to the claimant's burden. Further, this bill would create a significant administrative hardship as VA would be required to update all application forms to capture this data. VA does not support H.R. 628. This bill improperly conflates the concept of access to claims records with the concept of recognizing individuals to act as agents and attorneys in the VA benefits claims process. This bill requires that VA provide each claimant an opportunity to permit a congressional employee access to their records, which are stored behind VA's firewall. This is unnecessary as there are long-standing methods for Congress to obtain the consent of a VA claimant to disclose information. This bill would provide congressional staff with greater access to VA records than is provided to VA employees, whose access is limited to only records required to perform their duties. In effect, this bill exempts congressional staff from all FSMA requirements, which would be unprecedented. Additionally, VA would need to redesign its systems to allow more than one representative per veteran or claim, which would require extensive time, monetary expense, and manpower. VA would also have to track and adjust for changes in congressional seats to ensure that accesses were revoked timely and to inform veterans of such changes. The bill also limits VA from obligating or spending more than $10 million for the purposes of this bill. VA estimates $145.8 million would be required for implementation. These funds and resources could instead be utilized to support other system improvements, such as automation. While VA appreciates the intent of H.R. 4360, VA does not support this bill. The provisions of this bill are duplicative of recently passed laws. VA concurs that expeditious resolution of erroneous reporting is essential. However, VA has already implemented robust procedures to do so and partners with various credit agencies to repair credit when an error is discovered. VA continues to work on standardizing notifications and tracking metrics. VA has concerns as it relates to reviewing the information regarding dependents. In certain situations, it may not be appropriate for VA to provide a veteran with information about debts incurred by a dependent, such as when federal tax information of dependents is utilized. VA is also working on several initiatives designed to reduce or eliminate opportunities for overpayments to occur. For example, we are utilizing new or existing data matching agreements with other federal and state agencies. Additional overpayment reduction could be achieved if Congress were to enact VA's fiscal year 2020 legislative proposal, which allows access to FTI for contractors who work in VA systems. This would allow VA to continue modernization and automation efforts by moving FTI into current systems. Finally, VA supports the use of virtual technology to enable veterans to participate in their appeals hearings without the need for travel to a specific VA hearing location, and would also appreciate a minor clarification of existing law. However, VA does not support the language in this draft bill without amendments. As written, the draft language would specifically exclude non-disability compensation appeals from the option to conduct virtual hearings. This exclusion would be arbitrary, complicated, and would not help to serve veterans who are in need of these emerging technologies. Ms. Kim McLeod is here from the board to discuss this draft bill and will be happy to take your questions. VA appreciates Congress's support for our veterans and their survivors and looks forward to working with you and your staff to provide any technical support you may request. And I'm sorry for going over the 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Burke, for your testimony, and we'll now begin the question portion of the hearing. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and that was a perfect sequitur because I wanted to ask Ms. McLeod specifically about the draft legislation relative to the telehearings for BVA processes. And Ms. McLeod, can you speak to the challenges and successes that you've had with the telehealth pilot, and do you think that this program can be easily expanded?
Thank you for the question this morning. So yes, so far we've started phase 1 of the testing of virtual hearings or telehearings at the board. We started on July 26th and we went through September 30th. During that time, we held about 73 virtual hearings. What we saw was that for the most part, the veterans loved it. The veteran service organizations and other private bar attorneys also loved it. It allowed our most remote veterans to have access to hearings and not have to travel sometimes hours and hours away to get to a regional office to hold a hearing. We've also had several homebound veterans who could not travel without going through some extensive hardship to get to an RO to have a hearing. And so this just opens up the aperture for those veterans to have hearings and to really choose how they want to hold their hearings with the board and our judges. We believe that once we have the full integration of the IT system with our current new case flow system, we'll be able to offer this as an option, and we believe it's really going to allow us to bring down our backlog of virtual hearings with virtual hearings.
Well, thank you. And it sounds like it has been quite successful as a pilot, and we will look to reviewing the recommended changes for this legislation and see what could or should be incorporated prior to its introduction. I would also like to speak to Mr. Burke, specifically about H.R. 592, the Protect Vets from Financial Fraud Act, introduced by Ms. Brownlee. Specifically with that legislation, I have a hard time understanding why we would protect veterans from fiduciary fraud only in the case where the fiduciary serviced 10 or more veterans. Can you provide a breakdown between the number of veterans who have fiduciaries in each group? Like how many fiduciaries are responsible for 10 or more? Is that a normal circumstance? And how many are responsible for fewer than that?
Yes, thank you for that question. We have about 177,000 veterans that are in the fiduciary program, with approximately 170,000 distinct fiduciaries. So the predominance of the representation is less than 10 per fiduciary. That said, VA does support this bill, with the exception of some wording that we'd like to work with the committee on. As written right now, we would recommend strongly that the language be changed from the date the misuse was found to the date misuse occurred. If we stick with the wording that exists now, we will disadvantage some of those veterans that are served by fiduciaries in the very sense that there's a different process currently. And if we were to change the wording in the bill itself to date the misuse occurred, it would allow us, upon enactment of the bill, to actually treat veterans the same way, whether they were, whether it was the 10 count or less than 10.
Thank you, and thank you for those recommendations. We will look at that for further incorporation and consideration in the bill. I now recognize Mr. Boss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Burke, I just real quickly, in your testimony, though you're in agreement with it, You said the 1424 is unnecessary because the VA has an existing policy that allows for displaying of the battlefield cross in VA cemeteries. However, isn't it true that the VA can change that policy at any time to prohibit those monuments? And in fact, this legislation was prompted by VA's attempt in 3 different cemeteries to remove the memorial, and the only reason they went back is because there was a public outcry.
Yes, sir. What I would say is you are correct that VA does currently have a policy. VA could change the policy. We have no intention to. Therefore, we have no objection to this bill.
Right. That's why, hopefully, for the future, that people understand exactly what that monument is and what that symbol is. So, Ms. McLeod, you touched on this a little bit, but can you please give details to what security measures are in place to protect veterans' sensitive information from being improperly accessed at a board telehearing?
Well, sure. The board and the VA currently uses for the virtual hearings the same platform that VHA uses for the telehealth appointments. And so we follow all of the regular IT protocols, standards, and regulations for securing our platform. That is very important to us. It's been very important to VHA as they've been using the telehealth platform for the last at least 2 years. And we believe their privacy on the health side and the medical appointment side is as important as the hearing side. So that is very important that we maintain the level of security for veterans. And so we're following all of the IT standards and protocols for that.
Okay, at what point do you think that let me clarify this on what I'm asking. At what point do you think that we're going to be as comfortable with the teleconference as we are as sitting face-to-face? Are we to that point already, or are we still got some bugs to work out, or not?
So the only thing we're working out at this point is the integration between our new IT scheduling system for hearings and the telehealth platform. We were using a Generation 1 platform during the testing phase, but our Generation 2 is going to be integrated. And we believe at that point we'll be fully ready to, for full implementation. Right. I've got great stories of, veterans who are either homebound or VSOs who, instead of picking up all their veterans and traveling 2 hours to the Newark RO, are now holding virtual hearings out of their office, and they don't have to travel with the veterans who sit, waiting patiently, of course, all day at the RO 2 hours away from their home. So we believe it is a game changer, and veterans and veteran service organizations are really looking forward to opening up virtual hearings at the board.
Yeah, I think everybody is. I hope that we move as fast as possible, but make sure that we're secure as possible.
Absolutely, sir.
Mr. Berg, regarding H.R. 4165, the VA states it does not collect private citizens' information on veterans, such as minority group member status, when VA has no business and need to do so. However, your testimony also mentions the VA Minority Veterans Report, which provides a comparison of benefits usage among minority and non-minority veterans. Can you clarify the information that VBA collects on the minority status of veterans?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. Right now, the data referenced in the testimony is data that is collected on a voluntary basis. So the data itself is not representative of the aggregate of the veterans that we are serving. And so, in order to enact the bill as written, our position is that we don't need that information to administer the delivery of benefits. What we do publish, again, is information that is submitted to us or collected on a voluntary basis. There is no mandatory collection, and our concern would be that putting out information without the total picture, without it having full context, may misrepresent the intent of collecting that data to begin with.
Okay, thank you. With that, Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. I now recognize Mr. Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to ask you about the Justice for ALS Veterans Act of 2019, H.R. Bill 4748. In the VA's testimony, it states that the VA understands the intent of the bill and recognizes the important step in caring for surviving spouses. Regarding the Justice for ALS Veterans Act, what has been the VA's experience in treatment of this aggressive disease?
So, as you said, sir, thank you for the question. So, as you said, this is a terribly debilitating and progressive disease. This is one that VA take seriously. With respect to the bill itself, while we support the intent, our concern is merely about 2 points. It is, we want to make sure that we're not creating disparity between this progressive disease and others, such as cancer. The other thing that the bill would need some clarification on would just be a clarification in the bill itself that talks to whether or not the surviving spouse would need to be married for 8 years continuously before. We think with the progressive nature of the condition, it could be problematic if the bill was not clarified on that 8-year requirement.
In regard to other aggressive diseases, would the VA support legislation that included other aggressive diseases, such as cancer, as you mentioned?
Again, on this specific one, we are supportive of the ALS, except for the fact that it seems to draw a disparity between other conditions, and we would like to see all the progressive conditions treated in a similar manner.
And so if the disparity was removed, the VA would support that type of legislation?
Yes, sir.
All right. And in regards to the spouse, being married, if that clarification was made more clear, would the VA also continue to support the legislation?
Yes, sir. We think without clarifying the 8-year requirement, it could be problematic and actually go against the intent of the proposed legislation.
All right. That, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Sablan, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Great timing. I'm in between 2 hearings, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Mr. Burke, good morning. The telehearings for the board sounds promising, I'll be very honest, especially for veterans in my district in the Marianas and other remote areas in our country who would like to have easier access to hearings. So can you tell me what work the VA has done or plans to do to reach veterans in the territories, sir?
Yes, sir. If I have your question correct, it has something to do with the hearings.
Yes,
Or
sir.
commentary on the hearings. I have the fortunate pleasure to have Ms. McLeod from the Board of Veterans Appeals here with me today, and I will like to defer that response to her, sir.
Good morning, sir. So at this point, we continue to test and verify whether or not virtual hearings is going to be another opportunity for other veterans everywhere in the country and the island. So if we can get in touch with a representative and a veteran who's interested in holding a virtual hearing there, we're happy to make the connection and try to have that hearing. We want it to be open and available for all veterans to choose from.
Okay. Could I just say, for example, have one of my district office staff arrange a test hearing, and just so we make sure it works, for example?
Absolutely.
And this would be done through VTC or Skype or?
So yeah, right now it's the telehealth platform, and so essentially what they do is they receive an email which has a connection, a URL, they click on it, and we can try a compatibility test, and we're happy to try those with anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. And I just wanted to follow up from the written testimony that you provided ahead, specifically this section, and we're talking again about the telehearings. It says the board also seeks clarification for reporting on statistical outcomes of cases heard, as this would establish a broad reporting requirement without clear guidance as to specific intent. Can you further elaborate on that particular topic? And I think that the intent on our end would be to understand that there's similar outcomes between the existing system and the new system, or we hope from the optimistic outlook you have for this new system that we can see improved outcomes. But can you clarify specifically what the concern was in that phrase? It's on page 11, the next to the last paragraph.
Yes, ma'am. So I believe it's just so we understand what it is we're seeking in terms of the information. I don't believe right now we are gathering data with respect to the outcomes on our normal video hearings or central office in-person hearings. And so this would be more than what we currently look at it for virtual hearings. But understanding if that's the desire to find out what the actual outcomes through virtual hearings is, we would certainly try to determine what those are and collect that.
Okay, and just, it seems like potentially a process would be by customer satisfaction, to understand, the outcomes from the perspective of the veterans who participate in the hearings. That just, seems like a way that we might be able to gather data on the success of the program. So we can further clarify that offline, but I appreciate your feedback.
Thank you.
And Mr. Boss, do you have any follow-up questions? Do any other members have any follow-up questions?
Madam Chair, if I, we're asking questions on telehearings, is that correct?
You're able to ask questions on any of the bills
Of the
presented
two-
in this
of the
hearing.
two. Okay,
Yes.
I have one more question. Actually.
Yes, Mr. Sablan, you're recognized
you.
for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Burke, again, I'll come back to you. Do you know how many veterans are under fiduciary care in the Northern Mariana Islands?
I'd like to take that one for the record. I have overarching aggregate numbers, but not specifically for the area you're referencing, but we can get that.
When you do that, could you also please tell me what kind of systems are in place to protect veterans, both in CONUS, as they call it, or in the mainland and in the territories?
Yes, sir, and I could speak to that briefly now, and we'll certainly follow up with the specific information about the about your area, so we can give you those numbers. What I will tell you is that we have a very aggressive approach to treating allegations of misuse in our fiduciary program. We have steps in place to ensure that we are quick in removing a fiduciary and reappointing when misuse is determined and found. We have processes in place that would allow us to reimburse any money that was misused by a fiduciary. In fact, when a fiduciary currently that has 10 or more individuals is alleged of misuse, not only will we look at the misuse for the individual that was, that raised the alarm, but for all veterans under that fiduciary's care. In fact, we do that whether the fiduciary has one under their care or not. So we do have misuse process. We do internal investigative steps to ensure that we are reappointing a solid, dependable, reliable, trustworthy fiduciary and restoring benefits.
And that's standard throughout the country?
Yes, sir, that's correct. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. I would like to thank Mr. Burke and Ms. McLeod for your testimony today, and we will move on to the third panel. And while the third panel takes their seat, I'll go ahead and make introductions. Appearing before us today is Shane Learman, Assistant National Legislative Director of the Disabled American Veterans. We also have Mr. Brian Dempsey, Government Affairs Director of the Wounded Warrior Project, as well as Patrick Murphy, Deputy Director at the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and finally, Ashleen Haycock, Deputy Director of Policy and Legislation at the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. Thank you all for joining us today. Mr. Learman, I'll recognize you first for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Bost, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of DAV's more than 1 million members, we thank you for the opportunity to present our views at today's legislative hearing. Our written testimony addresses all of the bills and discussion drafts. However, my oral remarks will highlight just a few of these. Madam Chair, dependency and indemnity compensation, or DIC, is paid to surviving spouses when a veteran's death is determined to be service-connected. An additional DIC monthly payment, currently $280, is paid when a veteran was 100% disabled for 8 consecutive months prior to death. This is commonly referred to as the DIC kicker. H.R. 4748, the Justice for ALS Veterans Act of 2019, would extend the DIC kicker to surviving spouses of veterans who die from ALS regardless of how long the veteran was service-connected for the condition prior to death. VA regulations recognize ALS as a presumptive service-connected disease, and due to its progressive nature, is automatically rated at 100% disabling once service connection is granted. ALS is a completely consuming disease process, eventually taking away the ability to walk, dress, write, speak, swallow, and even breathe. The average life expectancy for a person with ALS is 2 to 5 years. DAV supports H.R. 4748 as it will extend the DIC kicker to survivors of veterans whose cause of death is ALS. The aggressiveness of ALS leaves many veterans totally incapacitated and reliant on family members and caregivers, and even in the best scenarios, generally does not allow life expectancy past 8 years. Madam Chair, currently there are approximately 60,000 pending hearings before the Board of Veterans' Appeals. We are concerned about this backlog of hearings and the time it adds to the overall appeals process. The Appeals Modernization Act changed statutory requirements for the appeals process, which provides only 2 options for a hearing before the board. 1, a hearing in person at the Board of Veterans' Appeals, and 2, a video conference hearing at a VA facility where the Secretary has provided a suitable location and equipment to conduct such hearings. Recently, the board established a pilot program that provides appellants the opportunity to attend a video conference hearing from any location, rather than traveling to their local VA regional office or another VA location that has suitable facilities. In September, the board pilot program reported an attendance rate of over 65%, which is roughly an increase of 15% over the usual hearing attendance rate. The board noted that a video hearing was conducted for a paralyzed veteran from their own home, so the veteran did not have to travel 175 miles to attend a video hearing at the St. Petersburg VA regional office. This legislation would amend the statute to allow appellants to have a video hearing at a location selected by the appellant via a secure internet platform established and maintained by the VA. DAV would support legislation that provides an additional option for video hearings, as this would increase the efficiency and timeliness of the appeals process. DAV, however, would recommend, as been noted, an amendment to the draft to allow all appeals before the board to have this additional option. In reference to H.R. 628, the Wingman Act, DAV does not have a resolution on this bill and does not support or oppose the legislation. We recommend that covered congressional employees be provided training, VA accreditation, or similar certification, and have safeguards in place to ensure that a veteran can be made whole in any instance of unintended harm. VSOs, agents, and attorneys are required to complete VA-mandated training and become accredited in order to be recognized by VA as being capable of assisting claimants with their affairs before VA. Covered congressional employees should meet the same standards of required VA training and accreditation. This will provide an increased knowledge of VA processes and provide accountability. If a covered congressional employee provides information, advice, or their lack of timely action causes financial harm to a veteran or a claimant, a process should be in place to ensure the veteran will be made financially whole. Madam Chair, this concludes my testimony. I would be pleased to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Learman. Mr. Dempsey, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Luria, Ranking Member Bost, and distinguished subcommittee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing and offer Wounded Warrior Project's views on legislation under your consideration. My name is Brian Dempsey, and I have the privilege of representing Wounded Warrior Project as a Government Affairs Director here in our Washington, D.C. office, and my testimony is informed by thousands of engagements with warriors across the country and overseas who have used programs and services delivered by our team and partners. The written testimony you've received reflects Wounded Warrior Project's views on each of the bills before you, but for today's hearing, I will focus on 3 that we believe are most aligned with the way our organization is serving the community. First, we are pleased to support H.R. 592, the Protect Veterans from Financial Fraud Act, and what it proposes to do for veterans who need a heightened degree of support to manage their financial affairs. Our organization's Independence Program helps warriors with high needs navigate public and private support programs to help them achieve meaningful levels of activity, purpose, and independence in their daily lives. Many in this program can attest that VA's fiduciary program has been successful in helping them manage the money they receive from VA. However, we know that some veterans enrolled in this VA program have been the victim of fiduciaries who have taken advantage of positions of trust to personally benefit at their veterans' expense. The Protect Veterans from Financial Fraud Act would remove an arbitrary barrier that currently limits some veterans from recouping lost benefits as a result of fraud and abuse, and we believe provides a necessary and overdue improvement to a system that must work as efficiently as possible for the most vulnerable warriors. Wounded Warrior Project is also pleased to support H.R. 4183, the Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Study Act. Our benefits services officers would share that some of the largest barriers to supporting National Guardsmen, reservists, and even some special operations personnel who suffered injuries and illnesses in combat are poor injury reporting procedures and challenges with retention and accountability of their service records. These shortcomings create a variety of obstacles for VSOs to help them file for their disability benefits. As an example, a Missouri veteran struggling with homelessness recently reached out to Wounded Warrior Project for assistance, including help with securing VA disability benefits. In 2004, this veteran was assigned to an Air Guard unit out of Kansas, tasked with flying injured and killed in action soldiers out of the Middle East to Germany and subsequently stateside. He discharged in 2005, and his unit reports that there are no records of the flights in which he participated, nor can they find his records. He was subsequently diagnosed with PTSD and major depressive disorder, but due to lost records, he has been unsuccessful in establishing service connection after multiple attempts. He has lost his house, his family is now divorced, and still resides in a homeless shelter in Kansas City, Missouri, where fortunately, Wounded Warrior Project staff have been working diligently to help him secure compensation for his injuries. While the Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Study Act may not provide immediate relief to veterans like this, we believe the bill would help validate many of the anecdotal stories we can share from the field, and we would be pleased to hear GAO recommendations for how to improve the care and benefit system for those who are struggling to achieve outcomes that match their sacrifices. Finally, Wounded Warrior Project is pleased to support H.R. 4360, the VA Overpayment Accountability Act. One of the benefits of being a VSO is having the ability to work with VA systems such as the Veterans Benefits Management System and VA's Share platform that allow us to monitor a veteran's claims file for adverse actions that could negatively impact the warriors we serve. One of those actions is debt recoupments that most veterans aren't even aware they are responsible for. There's not enough information or transparency from VA to help veterans understand their duties in scenarios like these. Unfortunately, not every veteran will benefit from the vigilance of a VSO or personally track their responsibility for follow-up when VA makes an erroneous overpayment. We believe this bill can mitigate the associated risks. Over a third of the post-9/11 wounded, ill, and injured warriors who register with Wounded Warrior Project carry more than $20,000 in debt, excluding mortgages. And when the domino effect of inaction begins to harm their credit, or when VA withholds payment that they depend on, trouble can manifest in many ways. Our organization recognizes that physical and mental health are often built from a foundation that includes financial security, and we believe the VA Overpayment Accountability Act would correct shortcomings in the benefit system that place veterans at unnecessary risk. While further improvements to the system can still be made, such as policies to address the burden of debt repayment when it becomes necessary, we are pleased to support this bill and the steps it takes to protect veterans' credit. In closing, I wish to express Wounded Warrior Project's support for other initiatives being considered by the subcommittee today, including those that take care to address issues being faced by women veterans, minority veterans, and veteran families. Our statement for the record reflects more thoughts on these bills, but we are pleased that others on today's panel can speak to the merits of these important pieces of legislation. We appreciate the opportunity to testify, and we thank you for allowing us to be part of this very important work as we care for and serve those who have served our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dempsey. I now recognize Mr. Murray for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Boss, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the VFW, thank you for the opportunity to testify on legislation pending before the subcommittee. The VFW supports the VA Overpayment Accountability Act and has some recommendations to improve it. This legislation would improve VA's debt collection process, limit the authority of VA to recover overpayments caused by its own errors, and improve due process. Many veterans who were never indebted to VA have had erroneous information submitted to consumer reporting agencies due to VA's mistakes. It is unconscionable for a veteran to receive a negative credit rating as a result of VA's error. Accordingly, the VFW supports legislation that requires VA to implement safeguards to prevent the submission of false information and to make corrections in a timely manner. Furthermore, the VA was pleased to review and offer feedback in the crafting of new, more simply worded letters of potential VA debts. We also request that VA collaborate with and inform VSOs regarding any updates to the standardized format of debt letters. Due process requires that debt notices following overpayments are clear and provide concise information about the steps a veteran must take in order to resolve any outstanding debts. The VFW also urges this subcommittee to incorporate provisions that would grant additional safeguards and more flexibility within the debt repayment system. The VFW supports the Protect Veterans from Financial Fraud Act of 2019. This legislation would ensure that VA repays the misused benefits of veterans with fiduciaries. This is a common-sense bill to protect some of our most vulnerable veterans. Individuals assigned a fiduciary need help and financial protection, and anyone who mistreats, preys upon, or otherwise causes them harm must be held accountable and full restitution must be made. Abusing the health and financial welfare of veterans in need must be punishable by law. Therefore, the VFW recommends imposing criminal and financial penalties on individuals found to prey upon veterans for personal gain. The VFW supports the Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Study Act and has a few recommendations to improve it. This legislation will require the GAO to conduct a study on VA disability and pension benefits provided to members of the National Guard and Reserves. In the years since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Guard and Reserve have faithfully answered the call to service. DoD has increasingly relied upon these components for missions at home and overseas. Unfortunately, these service members face unique challenges when applying for VA benefits. Guard and Reserve members frequently have trouble obtaining medical records, which tend to be scattered and incomplete. VA disproportionately denies reservists and guardsmen benefits because they can't establish a condition that is service-connected. The VFW recommends this committee authorize a study on benefits provided to members of the Guard and Reserve for the entirety of the global war on terror, not just the 10-year period. Furthermore, the VFW encourages the subcommittee to require VA to keep this data tracking as an ongoing analysis during the application and enrollment for benefits, not just simply for a specified amount of time. Additionally, the VFW supports the Improving Benefits for Underserved Veterans Act to further identify disparities in usage of VA benefits. This legislation would assist VA in ensuring that all veterans use the benefits to which they're entitled and that access to health care and outcomes remain consistent across all demographics. Additional knowledge about the VA population and who is using care and benefits will help identify where gaps occur and where resources can be targeted. The VFW supports the draft legislation to permit appellants to appear in disability compensation cases before the Board of Veteran Appeals by picture and voice from locations other than VA facilities. Emerging VA programs such as Telehealth and Project Atlas already utilize similar remote technology, and veterans have found these programs incredibly convenient. This legislation would undoubtedly improve access for veteran appellants and would permit a greater number of veterans to attend their own hearings. The VFW thinks this is an important provision, but urges this subcommittee to ensure that adequate internet security measures are implemented to prevent data breaches and safeguard sensitive information. Finally, the VFW supports the Veteran Spouse Equal Treatment Act. The VFW believes that all veterans and their families deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and the statutory language of Title 38 should be updated to conform to recent Supreme Court decisions. Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Bost, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my testimony. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you or any of the members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I now recognize Ms. Haycock for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Loria, Ranking Member Bost, and distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of surviving families of our nation's fallen heroes. Ending the penalty on remarriage for surviving military spouses is one of the top legislative priorities for TAPS. We are incredibly thankful to Representatives Waltz, Moulton, and Bacon for bringing it to the forefront this year. Preventing surviving spouses from maintaining benefits upon remarriage prevents them from being able to fully move forward with their lives and maintain financial security for themselves and their families. Many have children to consider and so commit to long-term relationships or engagements instead of legally remarrying. The average age of a military widow in the post-9/11 era is 25. They should not have to wait 32 years to legally remarry. Under current law, surviving spouses can legally remarry at age 57 and maintain all benefits except health care. If they choose to remarry after 57, they are no longer subjected to the SBPDIC offset or widow's tax and receive both benefits in full. The age 57 is arbitrary and leaves spouses waiting for years or decades to legally remarry. In one case, a surviving spouse who asked to remain anonymous was widowed in her 30s with young children. In her mid-40s, she met her second chance, who was also an Army lieutenant colonel. After a couple of years, they got engaged, but still have 7 more years before they actually get married. Her fiancé believes that taking her benefits away is disregarding her late husband's sacrifice and his nearly 20 years of service. She also asked me to make the committee aware of his situation. He got married while on leave from Afghanistan many years ago. They had 2 children and were only married for 4 years. When it came time to PCS, she filed for divorce as she did not want to leave her hometown. He served well over 20 years. She receives 12% of his retired lieutenant colonel's pension for life, even if she remarries. In this case, we hold former spouses in higher regards than we do those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Many military spouses wanted to share their story with us, but asked to remain anonymous, because in addition to the remarriage penalty, there's also a federal statute that prevents them from holding themselves out to be married. The clause is incredibly vague, and arguably, VA could take away their benefits because they cohabitate. While very few people have actually lost benefits due to this clause, surviving military spouses in long-term relationships live in fear of being investigated because someone turned them in for holding themselves out to be married. The clause in federal statute should be removed because, honestly, it's archaic. TAPS also believes that several other provisions should be considered as well, so as to fully restore benefits for remarried spouses. TAPS would like to see surviving military spouses able to retain education benefits upon remarriage. The Frye Scholarship is one of the most important benefits we have given surviving spouses. Education benefits provide surviving spouses additional financial freedom. As we know, military spouses are one of the most unemployed and underemployed populations. Due to frequent moves, careers become difficult to maintain, and it's almost impossible to fully vest in their own retirement, which is why the SBP benefit is so important. After the death of their service member, many choose to follow their own dreams and pursue a career such as going into mental health, teaching, or nursing. Just because they find love again does not mean they should not be afforded the same economic opportunities. We've seen time and time again the importance of our investment into the GI Bill, and this should be no different. In addition, it's not just financial benefits that survivors lose upon remarriage. It's access to all of the abilities to be their children's guardians in the eyes of DoD and TRICARE. They do not have access to any TRICARE records or referrals. The story of Kane and Mackie Fugler, whose husband died in 2010 and who legally remarried in 2017, illustrates this point. She was fine with giving up the financial benefits, but never thought it would jeopardize her ability to take care of her children. In June 2018, her youngest daughter, Hannah, was hospitalized after having flu-like symptoms and losing 20 pounds in 2 weeks. She was only 9 years old at the time. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. TRICARE needed new HIPAA forms every time they talked to Kanan, because they did not view her as her child's legal guardian. Kanan tried to change her daughter's primary care doctor in the system, only to learn she no longer had access to it. She had to physically mail forms as she no longer had electronic access to her children's TRICARE. Minor children do not have their own accounts, and Kanan does not have an account because she's no longer in DEERS. As her daughter obviously has a long-term debilitating condition and needs a lot of medical care, yet she cannot help her child and has to wait weeks for referrals instead of being able to do it electronically. Just because she is remarried does not make her any less her children's only living parent. TAPS requests the committee pass legislation that would end the hold yourself out to be married clause, reinstate education benefits for remarried spouses, and restore access to electronic medical records for those who are guardians of minor children, in addition to restoring the SBP and DIC for remarried spouses. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Haycock, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. We'll now move on to the question portion of the hearing, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. The first question for Mr. Dempsey and Mr. Murray, as you both discussed this in your testimony. Can you provide an example of how the VA might provide erroneous or derogatory information to a consumer reporting agency due to their own error? And do you believe that negative credit reporting might produce extreme hardship, especially for lower income veterans?
Ma'am, the credit reporting that is erroneously done causes years of sometimes financial hardship that if anybody who's had to do it knows that it's a pretty burdensome process to chase those down and get the appropriate records. Having VA assist in that as actively as they can is something that can help ease that burden for veterans. Doing it on your own is a tough process. We recommend in this legislation adding some flexibility of kind of preventing VA from automatically reporting if the overpayment is under dispute. Some flexibility so that there's a little bit of time for the veteran who may have had that erroneous overpayment notification to put a hold on that while the situation gets adjudicated before it gets sent to the reporting company.
And I think that you also made some recommendations specifically about the notification process to veterans so that they were better informed and could more clearly understand the debt to the VA. Can you comment on that?
Yes, ma'am. We do thank VA that we were allowed, as a collaborative effort, to help to clarify the debt notification process. We hope that it can always improve so that clear and concise notification about what is owed and why that overpayment might have been made, the processes for rectifying that, maybe a payment plan, or what steps need to be taken. Those are things that we think is vitally important so that it's not a simple, not as simple of a notification that they receive that's too confusing.
Thank you, and thanks for your work on that. Mr. Dempsey, did you have more to add?
Only a minor bit. I would share many of Mr. Murray's comments as well. And to the point of improving the process of notifying a veteran, I'd say that the typical process typically relies on regular mail these days. There's typically not phone call, email, and mail typically goes to last known address, which, as we know, veterans like others move around, and given the short window of time that this typically takes place, relying on an older mail system would require an improvement, but I would obviously commend VA for efforts that they're already undertaking to improve the process.
So on that, can you comment on the e-notice that's outlined in the bill?
I can't specifically recall what the text of the bill says, but I would support initiatives to improve information technology systems that would support the process.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, again, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the Wingman Act does not adequately safeguard veterans' privacy. Can you describe the potential impact on veterans' privacy if the appropriate privacy controls are not put in place if this act were to be implemented?
Absolutely. So the VFW accredits about 2,500 veteran service officers across the country, and our collective organizations, it's thousands, and they go through rigorous training with privacy safeguards in place so that, something that a layperson might not recognize is a disclosure of sensitive information without training, without just the knowledge of what it is they're actually looking at. While it sounds like something that's it's a very easy, let me just look up your file and tell you where it's at, you are actually looking at someone's medical information without the proper training and just even letting them know what you can and can't say to your office mates or your boss, whatever it might be. Things like that could disclose information that the patient might not want. Even if they did ask you to look at their file, we recommend that while this sounds like a great idea, a little bit of training would make it even better so that everybody's collective staffs would know exactly what they're doing so that they aren't harming themselves or the patient they're looking after.
Thank you. And Mr. Learman, I believe you also mentioned this in your written testimony. Do you have any additional feedback on the Wingman Act and whether it would be helpful or potentially harmful to the privacy of veterans?
Thank you. Not so much as interest to the privacy of the veteran, more of we want to make sure that veterans and their claimants would have certain safeguards or protections. So as Mr. Murray said, training really is a big part of this. We want to make sure if this does move forward, they're provided the same level and types of trainings that VSOs, attorneys, and claims agents are. So one, not only do they understand privacy issues, but more importantly, they understand exactly what it is they are looking at, because it's not as simple as just opening up via VBMS and knowing the status. You really have to understand what's been submitted, the process, where it is. So we just want to make sure that if this does move forward, adequate training is provided just to make sure they're not providing any information or misinformation that may harm a veteran.
Thank you. And I believe I'm out of time for this round, so I will pass it to Mr. Boss for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Ms. Haycock. Does TAPS have any recommendations for the ways that H.R. 1911 could be amended to better serve surviving family members?
Sure. So because parts of the bill do fall under DOD, we know that some of the healthcare provisions that we recommend as far as access to records would fall under them. We do believe that they could also include a provision to allow surviving spouses to cohabitate, so removing the hold yourself out to be remarried clause, as well as including provisions to allow surviving spouses to maintain education benefits upon remarriage.
Okay. So the next question I have is for the whole panel. Can you each describe the extent to which your organization received any consultation prior to the rollout of the board's telehearing program, and then also any suggestions you might have for the rollout that might even improve it or speed the process up? Mr. Lehrman, I guess you.
Thank you. Yes, DAV was invited and provided all of that information before it was rolled out. We have an office at the Board of Veterans Appeals, our National Appeals Office, and they were involved from day one with the process, understood it. They've participated in several of these hearings, and we're getting positive feedback from our office that it's being very effective, especially as has been noted, for veterans who have limited access to VA facilities due to distance or their disabilities.
Mr. Dempsey?
At the risk of misstating the amount of engagement that Wounded Warrior Project receives, I can't determine whether or not we were engaged at that stage. But what I would say is that the majority of assistance we're providing with veterans is at the pre-Board of Appeals stage, so Board of Veterans Appeals stage. So I'd limit it to that for now.
Sir, the VFW also has an office at the Board of Veteran Appeals, and much like my colleague said, we were involved in some of the initial origins of this, and we would encourage to expand this for rural and veterans affected by distance and their disabilities to every extent practical.
You probably weren't affected, so that, yeah. So, okay, now I've got a question also on the Wingman Act. The reason I'm asking this is you're not opposed to the legislative office having the ability. You're just requesting that some education goes along with it. Is that correct?
Sir, recently we went out to Montana, where one of the initial Project Atlas sites is, and worked with Senator Tester's staff and went through a modified training course so that his staff knew exactly how to handle constituents and cases like this. We'd be more than happy to provide some kind of a framework for training. We don't want just the average layperson to be able to open up someone's file and provide the wrong information and send a veteran off to the wrong place. Training and education would make that something that we could get behind.
And you are correct, we don't oppose the legislation, but training really is the big key. Personally, having represented veterans for 21 years, there is a lot of information contained within the file. You really need to understand not only what you're reading, but what you're relaying, because some of the information you relay or the advice you give could actually be detrimental. So we just want to make sure that there is a lot of training and even possibly an accreditation or certification process that holds some accountability for them, so that way we all know they're trained, they're educated, and they're providing good service to veterans.
Mr. Dempsey?
Yes, I'd echo a lot of the statements of my colleagues here at the table, while adding that we clearly support the intent of providing the best possible constituent services for veterans and non-veterans alike, and that our reservations about the bill are mostly focused just on training and staff turnover for organizations that have VSO service officers across the country. There's a lot more capacity to absorb any staff turnover or ensure that anyone representing a veteran is adequately trained. And while I have no doubt that several member offices would be able to provide great service through covered congressional staff in the event that there's turnover, or just staff that may not be as good at the job they've been expected to perform. Just that the Wingman Act may provide help and support for many, but maybe at the possible exposure of risk in other situations.
I appreciate that, and my time's expired, but I want to just quickly say that I guess I'm blessed better than most, because my two caseworkers that work are both themselves disabled veterans and were VSOs as well. So and I've watched, and it's kind of like when you come to this place, the acronyms that flow out, and you've got to know what those acronyms are, and because sometimes I have to slow them down and say, okay, now give me the full word. So, but thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I now recognize Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for what you do for our veterans. Mr. Murray, VFW is the only VSO we have in the Northern Marianas, and while they're organized, they're probably loosely organized. I stand to be corrected, but I think while they do provide help to other veterans, no one in the organization has actually received formal training on how to help veterans on the different aspects of case that they may have. Having said that, I had a wounded warrior fellow in the office, but I doubt also that fellow was given enough training to handle complex veterans case. But I will reach out to someone in the VA for more training for my veteran caseworker. Mr. Learman, my goodness, no one could explain better how sad and difficult it is for someone who has ALS, say the remaining lifespan they have, and it's unfortunate for those that are service-connected. But I understand. Thank you also for your service. So as you know, veterans who serve in the reserve unit report having harder times getting their disability benefits. I will tell you from personal experience, sir, that at my request, the only record the Army had of my service was the 3-day I had at Fort Jackson in processing. I never served basic and AIT. I never served weekend trainings. I never served the annual trainings. Although I was in the local legislature and I missed 2 annual trainings because we're in the appropriation process during the summers. But do you think that Mr. Khanna's bill, the Identifying Barriers and Best Practices Study Act, is helpful to better evaluate the hurdles that many of the veterans face?
I think it'll be helpful in potentially addressing different MOSs and different types of military jobs versus their types of disabilities, yes. As far as identifying barriers between active duty and reserve or guard, we're pretty confident we already know there's a big difference because the laws regarding service connection for both of those is completely different. So we already know there is going to be a difference noted in the report if you compare somebody who solely was in the Guard or Reserves for inactive duty or active duty for training, but never went on active duty versus someone who spent their entire enlistment or career on active duty. So there will be a difference noted in that type of a comparison.
Right, which is why I tell many of our reservists who get deployed or our National Guard who get deployed that don't sign that piece of paper getting deactivated unless you think that all of your health conditions are being addressed by the Department of Defense, because once you sign that paper and you move towards the VA, it's a whole new world out there. And so, let me ask anybody who may have, I don't have very much time, but I know how impactful VA debt can be for veterans and how long it takes for the VA to correct it. So can you tell me in a few words how important it is for the VA to get debt management actions and corrections right? Please, anyone.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big issue. And one of the biggest issues, and we testified at a hearing about this a few weeks ago, the way they notify a veteran is extremely confusing, or the person who has the debt. First, they send out a letter from the VA Regional Office of Jurisdiction advising that there may have been an overpayment made without a lot of specific information. Then 30, 60, or 90 days later, they may get a debt letter from the Debt Management Center telling them, you owe us $10,000, and if you don't start paying it now, we're going to take what you have. So I think a lot of the process that gets really confusing is All of the information required isn't in one notice, and it's not easily given to them, as was mentioned, via email or even through e-benefits.
I don't have too much time left. Anybody want to take a quick stab? No? That's, all right, that's fine. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. And how do I get my records besides more than the 3 days that I've got? You have any idea?
I would be happy to work with you and connect you with folks on our
It took me
Wounded
a
Warrior
long time to get it. I finally got it from Kansas or Louisville or someplace, but that's all they have.
I'd
I
be
was
hap-
never actually in any of the trainings that I participated in.
Sorry, I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sablon. We can continue with a second round of questions. So, Mr. Sablon, if you have more questions, we'll get back to you in a few minutes. Okay. So, Ms. Haycock, I wanted to recognize that you're the surviving daughter of Army Sergeant First Class Jeffrey and Air Force Senior Airman Nicole Haycock, and thank you for your willingness to testify today and the work that you do to assist survivors. So you've mentioned several issues, and thank you for bringing up some that I was not aware of, and that we will continue to investigate, how we can make a remedy to some of these policies that seem inequitable, especially about remarriage of surviving spouses. Just if you could take a minute today, can you talk about what is the most common thing that you're hearing from surviving spouses, amongst, we've talked about SBP DIC offset, the specific remarriage clauses, but can you just take a few minutes to talk about, what's the most pressing issue that you hear today from surviving spouses?
The widow's tax far and away is the #1 priority for TAPS and several other organizations. It's been an 18-year fight. My mom was actually on the Government Relations Committee for Gold Star Wives for many years before she passed herself. So I've been fighting this fight since I was 10 years old. It's a huge priority for us, and it became even more crucial this year when there were the changes to the tax laws that caused the kiddie tax issue. And the kiddie tax issue, which of course put surviving children in a over 30% tax bracket this year, so not all surviving families would be made whole by ending the widow's tax, but a bulk would, because the child option only exists to help families with minor children who were offset. So there would still be families, especially those with remarried spouses or those who were never married, who would still be subjected to the kiddie tax if we don't fix both. But those are the two big bills that we've been really pushing in this space. They're long overdue, and we know that the kiddie tax was an unintended consequence, but we look forward to seeing it get done this year.
Well, I appreciate that feedback, and as mentioned earlier when we discussed these, the current NDAA does fix the SBP DIC offset, and we're working very hard to fix the kiddie tax issue. I introduced a bill, HR 2481, which was incorporated in the Secure Act, which passed almost unanimously in the House, and we're waiting for the Senate to look at that bill and hopefully move that forward, and they've also considered separate legislation. So we're working very hard to close the loop on that and make sure that we get that across the finish line, because I've had groups of surviving spouses, a group of widows in Virginia Beach, who sat down and came to me and said, why are my taxes more? And I know that we have to fix this. And so thank you for continuing to be such a strong advocate for all of the families and the children who are affected by this. And we look forward to continuing to work with you to remedy these things that we think should be corrected. So thank you for being here. With that, I am complete with my questions. Mr. Boss, do you have any further questions for the panel?
Just the only question I would have, and I know it's a draft bill, so I think, Mr. Lieberman, you mentioned 47, 48. If it is, it just got that number. That it would be the one that deals with Lou Gehrig's disease. Is that the number that you have?
Yes,
okay,
sir.
When we were talking earlier, and I think this is a very large concern, because I think all of us see the problem and really want to deal with it, as well as the VA themselves. But do you not have the same concerns that, let's say, somebody that has a fast, aggressive cancer, they don't qualify, but yet someone under this law would then say, but if they have ALS would?
Well, that is a big concern, and that is something we discuss internally. How do you separate the differences of those out? Now, speaking about just ALS is a very unique disease process within the VA community for the fact that it's the only presumptive that applies to all veterans, regardless of time, service, or generation or exposures. So given that it is a unique disease process is a presumptive and that it's an automatically 100% disability due to the severity of it, we support that because we know it's not going to be much longer. As far as other diseases and other disease processes, that is something that, yes, we're willing to consider and discuss. Right now, I would be badly armed if I tried to engage that completely, but yes, that is something that we would be open to discuss.
Right, and that's kind of where the concerns probably all of us have are wanting to make sure that we get the right numbers together. We want them to be provided for. We don't want to just all of a sudden pull a rug out that all of a sudden, oh, well, you weren't diagnosed long enough for your surviving spouse to, that's a problem. That's a real problem, especially if it's due them. So hopefully we can all work together to try to figure out some kind of answer there. Of course, then you have to come up with the offset to try to figure out that as well. That's kind of our responsibility. So with that, I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Boss. Since there are no more questions, we will conclude this hearing. I want to thank the members of both panels for your participation today, as well as all of the other members who attended to present testimony on their bills that are under consideration. All members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, including extraneous materials. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.